A week after the attacks in Paris, we caught up with Channel 4's Jon Snow to talk about press freedom and liberty. Jon, what does a free press mean to you?
I think the fourth estate has become blurred because of the social media more than anything else in citizen journalism, and I think that's probably a good idea, a good thing. But a free press is really the core of any human existence. I mean, I think that if you can't talk to each other, if you can't transmit information to each other, then the one thing which distinguishes us from all other animal life is absent. And what's the point of that? So I think it's a structural thing. It is something which you understand when you see it, but perhaps it's quite difficult to define. Of course, the events in Paris went to the whole essence of freedom of speech. You know, I didn't much like quite a lot of the content of Charlie Hebdo, but on the other hand, I absolutely defend their right to publish.
The world turned its cameras to Paris on January the 7th. Religious extremists attacked the French capital and murdered 10 journalists in the process at the Charlie Hebdo offices. Are these kind of attacks going to intimidate journalists?
I think journalists are intimidated by the sensitivities of some religions, and it's not exclusive to Islam. You know, very often we have no idea what offence involves. I mean, it's very difficult to know precisely what is and is not offensive. So, for example, I've worked a lot in Iran, where the image of the Prophet is not as guarded as it is in Sunni Islam. In Iran, the Shias do have images of the Prophet. So it can be confusing to somebody who knows very little about Islamic practice and belief. Yeah, I think we are intimidated a bit by it. You're intimidated by the unknown, but not, I think, actually by the threat of death. I think that's, you know, extreme and unlikely. You're more likely to be run over in front of your own house just crossing the street than you ever are to be destroyed by a fanatic. But it's less than that. I think you do feel a sensitivity, partly because you don't, and whether that's not intimidation, is it? But you feel a bit of a sensitivity about it, yes.
What does Je suis Charlie mean to you?
I tweeted, I am Charlie, I am the Jewish shoppers, I am the Muslim policeman, which I felt rather more comfortable with, to be absolutely honest. I'm probably not Charlie, I mean in a literal sense. I'm Jon, and I don't think Jon would have done what Charlie did, but I defend the right of Charlie to do it. So that's why I'm prepared to tweet support, for sure, that I am Charlie. It means to me that I'm in complete solidarity with those who defend a free press, and that, I think, is the core of it.
Turkey and Egypt have some of the highest numbers of journalists in jail, but they also condemn the attacks. Is this just a PR stunt?
Well, I mean, there's no way in which anyone could regard President Sisi of Egypt as a defender of a free press. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. I mean, he is actually one of the few world leaders who's actually locked up large numbers of journalists for doing no more than their job. It's completely scandalous that he should in any way regard himself as somebody who can speak out about the events in Paris. It's precisely his sort of antics that make information flow, understanding between nations, understanding between citizens, so difficult. As for Mr. Erdogan, the Turkish president, well, he seems to be on some transit of some description from a pretty good prime minister to a fairly dreadful president. And he seems to have got religion, in inverted commas, in a rather big and potentially macabre way.
Even Saudi officials showed support. Is this going to make journalists feel uncomfortable?
Well, I think certainly what's happened after Paris is that hypocrisy has been, the flavour of the day from many of these world leaders. We've mentioned Egypt, but Saudi Arabia really takes the biscuit. I mean, this is the country which exports radical Wahhabi preachers, and then is some way startled when their teachings to vulnerable and mixed up kids ends in the terrible events in Paris. No, I mean the Saudi sympathy and understanding for what happened in Paris, I don't think is acceptable. They have to put their own house in order before the rest of the world's prepared to listen to them in expressing any kind of sorrow for what happened in Paris. What happened in Paris ultimately, at least to some extent, can be tracked back to states like Saudi Arabia that foster this kind of extremist belief.
Going back to the school massacre in Pakistan by the Taliban, how has the coverage differed in the Western media from Paris?
Well, of course, there's been much more access. Access does have a big impact. If the Pakistani school had happened in a European country, it would obviously have been an even bigger event than it was. But I think both were pretty well treated. I think we've got greater reason to be critical of ourselves for not doing more about Boko Haram in Nigeria, who may have killed up to 2,000 people whilst this Paris event was going on. And so, but again, that's about access. The fact is you can't get into northern Nigeria to look at these people, and there are no pictures coming out. Television is about pictures, and so to some extent the weight of the story is actually about access rather than about its overall importance.
According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, the last 3 years have been the bloodiest since records began. Is the increasing death toll damaging the freedom of the press?
I think there's no question whatever, and you feel it yourself when you're in the field, that journalists have now become an acceptable target. Certainly when I started sort of 40 years ago, the idea of shooting journalists was not, frankly, mainstream. There was very little of it, very, very little. You might die in an accidental spin-off from a bomb explosion or something, but the idea that you'd be targeted was not really there. Now, with the spread of the media penetration across the world, those tyrannical forces that want to extinguish information will kill journalists. And so I'm sorry to have to say that I think the figures illustrate a truth.
When does journalism turn into breaking the law? Should we be taking more or less measures to protect people like Snowden?
Snowden's a very interesting and intriguing case, and I think quite a lot of governments have been grateful for what they've learned. I think unquestionably the Germans were absolutely horrified to discover that their own Chancellor's telephone was being bugged by the United States. And I would argue that governments have an obligation to protect somebody like Snowden. I think there is a huge contrast between him and Assange, for example. I think Assange is a much less clear-cut situation, but Snowden, I think, will go down as one of history's great whistleblowers. And I think that his whistleblowing was extremely responsible. There's no evidence whatever that anybody's ever died as a result of what Snowden disclosed. The idea that in some way security was so compromised that individuals in the field were all going to get killed just does not seem to have been true. There's a lot of phooey about it all. And personally, I'd like to see Germany, or even ourselves, although that's unthinkable because we're so enslaved to the American psyche, but I'd like to see Germany accord some degree of diplomatic protection to Snowden.
John Simpson described the BBC as a grotesquely managed corporation. What makes Channel 4 different? Do you agree with John?
Well, I'm a huge admirer of the BBC, I have to say. I mean, I live my life listening to the BBC. I don't watch so much of its output, but the radio is extremely important to me, and I think is a brilliant, wonderful thing which doesn't exist really in such quality anywhere in the world. So I would certainly fight hard to protect it and preserve it. I don't know anything about the bureaucracy. I mean, it's not for me to say whether it's well or badly run. I have no idea. All I know is that the product's pretty good. And I don't think they'd have me work for them, but then that's because I'm a bit of an oddball. But I think, no, it's a great institution, and I hope it's preserved for all time. And that people from, the LCC end up getting good jobs there.
Has press freedom increased or worsened since your early days as a journalist?
Well, I think press freedom has actually increased vastly, and for that, again, we're grateful to the social network. It is extremely difficult for tyrannies to suppress information. I mean, you've got to remember that even when I began as a journalist, you could be 5 days between the moment the event happened and the moment you could ever get the footage that you'd shot of it on the air. News travels fast. It really does, faster than it ever has in history. And it's having a huge impact. And no, I think, the old concept of press freedom, that it was in some way restricted to a few newspapers and, radio station here and there and a television station, that's all over. And it's been detonated to some extent by the capacity to get round it. I mean, to get round the authorities' attempts to prevent you spreading information. And I think you see it very vividly in China.
What can citizen journalists add to press freedom?
So far as the citizen journalist is concerned, I think they can add an absolutely amazing amount. I mean, they won't get paid for it. That's the problem. It's monetizing what you can do. If you can write, if you can film, if you can edit, you have a terrific future. The problem is, can you earn money from it? Well, the answer is yes, if you're good enough and if you're clever enough at placing it. And so I actually think there's more opportunity through citizen journalism than there's ever been for people to become full-blown hacks.
What's the clever way to consume news these days, bearing social media in mind?
I suppose, to be honest, pick and mix. Kind of a bit here and a bit there. I mean, I think all of us now pick up stuff from Twitter, from Facebook, from the telly, from the radio. So I don't think there's any. I think the main thing is to be open to every possible methodology of receiving information. And we've kept talking about a free press, freedom of speech and the rest of it. The freedom to pick and mix from the assorted sources, masses of sources of information, is a great blessing, but also a bit of a curse because you might miss something.
Thanks, Jon. This has been Josh for Artefact TV.